Hello, legends and star pals. It's Lindsay and Sarah here with your May 2025 month ahead astrological forecast. Sarah, how you doing? We've just been
We are
laughing.
here, which means we survived April. I
Whoop,
mean,
whoop.
by the time you're seeing this, we have survived April. So we're gonna declare it on faith as we record this.
I'm
What I'm
knocking on
referring
wood.
to as the third decan of April, where the reverberations of April's astrology continue to be felt throughout the lands.
Yeah, I think everything, it feels really like Mercury retrograde and I think it's just because so much got kicked off like during the Mercury retrograde and it's just now it's like coming to fruition and it's woof.
The
Yeah.
Pisces Aries crossover place that we spent some time talking about for April. I really feel that. I feel those transits across those two signs, which feel like the big ending, big beginning place in the
Hmm.
zodiac. But yeah, so many retrograde cycles piled on top of each other, also on the heels of eclipse season. Yeah, it's
Wow.
hard to even. And now I think Neptune and Aries, I think it's harder for me than usual to tease apart what is what that's happening. So it's all the layers, and it's also, I think, Neptune kind of making a cloudy ocean for
Mm.
delineations.
Mm. Well, yeah, inquiring minds need to know, did you notice the Neptune transit? Have you noticed like any topics around like those houses or signs changing for you in April?
Well, what I noticed, I think it was a text exchange you and I had very randomly around the ingress where we realized that we had transitioned from talking about Neptune as like ethereal and like what is it and I feel confused and I'm eluded to a really angry god of the sea, which I think has to do with the transit. Like all of a sudden we're talking about Neptune as like somebody who's really fucking with everything and like making it hard to understand. Like the tone of what Neptune is doing has shifted, I think, from in a way that I think is representative of the move from Pisces to Aries. Suddenly it feels like a warrior like confusion, like scrambling for your enemies rather than like, I
Nice.
don't know, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that sort of diffuse Pisces energy to the like pretty concentrated, pointed Aries energy. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been feeling it for sure. I think that I basically got to an underlying health issue that's been sort of below all these other health issues that I've been having, and it left my sixth house. So almost like this fog lifting and being like, oh, this is the thing.
I
So really
remember
interesting.
I remember other astrologers talking about that sometimes, especially with the outer planets, that part of what you feel first is where it isn't rather than where it is, because outer planets can take a really long time to sort of like the effect to like settle in for us. And like whether it's angular or not could make a big difference. But I wonder, with what you're noticing, I wonder what does that give you any prescriptions for your seventh house and the chapter of Neptune being in your seventh house?
Watch out
Wonder.
for systemic issues. I can feel in my seventh already, even like being in this position where I'm single for the first time in like up 15 years and really being like, I don't actually know what I want in partnership right now. Even if I want partnership romantically, at least. So that has been like a really interesting manifestation as well of being
Hmm.
like, I guess I'll find out, which really feels very Neptunian because
Yeah.
I was hearing someone talk about it as Neptune, you don't get to say yes or no or pick and choose. Like it's just like something washes over you and it's sort of like
Mhm.
being in the ocean. You can try to fight it, but you might drown if you do.
You might drown. Yeah.
You got to just kind of
Yeah.
move with the current.
Riding the waves of whatever Neptune is
Yeah.
bringing.
Yeah. So under the Mercury Neptune conjunction, that was the first planetary conjunction in Aries with Neptune. I upped my weightlifting to the heaviest weights I've ever lifted, like in my whole life. So that was really interesting. That sort of strength that I mysteriously, I guess, just like, I don't know where it came from, but that was fun. That was a fun
That's
expression of
cool.
that. And then my second question is, how was the Mars exit from Cancer finally? into
Again,
Leo.
I trace this to our text exchange where I was trying to do the things that I usually do to experience comfort and grounding and all of that. And literally none of those things worked. Like the practices that I have for taking care of myself were all resulting in not large scale disasters, but just like miniature earthquake like disasters. Like I could not get comfort. I spilled my perfect delicious beverage all over my car, literally my car, and had to clean it
Ugh,
up. Like the person who was doing my manicure and pedicure hurt me with the Dremel. And they're just
ouch.
like those kind of things, which for someone who was preparing for Mars to ingress her first house was intense and unwelcome and had that sort of 29th degree of the 12th house quality of like, what does this mean about me? That's something terrible and I don't know what I'm gonna do. And I was like, everything felt like hidden enemies and just, it was fraught. It felt really fraught coming into the ingress
Yeah.
for me. What about for you? What did it feel
Yeah.
like?
I was transiting my midheaven because my midheaven is at 29 Cancer. So that's always an interesting one where Mars is like peak anoretic in the sign of its fall. But I actually tried planetary remediation, which for folks listening is basically a way to try to mitigate bad transits. So Mars in a very visible place, squaring my first house. This was also under the Venus direct station. I decided to get my septum pierced.
Oh,
And
that's
we were
right.
talking
Oh
about
my
that.
gosh.
Yeah, I just thought a square to the first house by Mars, which is my malefic out of sect, seems like putting a hole in my face with a sharp needle and then putting a piece of jewelry there for Venus seemed like that would be a good way to redirect some of that energy. And I think it worked. I'm here to tell that I think it worked because I got that done on Friday. And then the next week, I had a very successful series of 10th house things happen,
Mm.
including giving a astro beginner or intro to astrology workshop at University of New Mexico, which was really cool. And it surprised me. Chris Brennan reached out and asked if I would come onto the astrology podcast and do an episode on Venus retrograde in the news with him and Nick Dagan Best. So that was my second appearance on the astrology podcast. And so that episode, I'm sure, will be out by the time this is out. So yeah, I was like, I think it worked. I choose to believe that it worked.
And I that counts for a lot. And I, as someone with a fallen natal Mars, I just want to say to everyone, that's not the prescription for everyone. Like most of us do not pierce anything or even just touch sharp things when Mars is doing major transits because we will get hurt. Like our person will hurt us with the Dremel, for instance. So just be careful out there if you don't have an exalted natal Mars. You may not have that. I call it Lindsay's privilege, Lindsay's
Mars
star
privilege.
privilege.
Mars
But also,
privilege.
what you're talking about is cool because, again, it's to me, it's also an example of what it feels like for Mars to leave a place. It feels like this like freedom and like forward energy and more of a pleasant energy that was able to then kind of take hold in your 10th house. But then also,
Mhm.
like Mars is not only like pain now or like acute bad, it can also be things like ambition or like jump starting something.
I've really been experiencing Mars viscerally lately as
Mm.
wherever it is, it's just like, go. I was terrible at it, but I ran track in high school and it's like the pistol at the starting line, like that feels like Mars to me lately. Now it's in my 11th where I have got all types of planets going.
Yeah.
I'm driving to the West Coast with one of my best friends. We're doing this LA Astro Fest and there are going to be all kinds of people there and it's networking and presenting and it's kind of like balls to the wall, but it's go time in the 11th house.
Yeah.
So here we
Yeah.
are. Wow. All right. Well, April, I mean, it April was a time. I am proud of our reasonability with approaching April because I did hear a lot of astrologers being like, "We're so back," and I'm like, "We are not back in April, not the
Mm-mm.
month that we're so back." I don't know that there's a we're so back month this year, not to make anyone despair, but there's so much change happening, so it's kind of
Yeah.
like we're so starting something new is really big
Hmm.
energy, but we're so back. I don't know. I think it depends on your chart. So, Sarah, what is the biggest thing happening in May that everyone needs to know about before we go in?
I think it's Saturn. I think the biggest thing in May is Saturn in a new sign.
Saturn and a new
That happens
signs.
every 3 years. And a lot of our life cycles and development are tied to Saturn cycles. And so these are huge transits for all of us.
Yes, yeah. So we have a Saturn ingress into Aries on May 25th. Saturn will come back into Pisces this year and actually come back to about the point where it is now. So that's pretty interesting to think about, like
That is.
Saturn revisiting these same degrees where so much has happened with the Venus direct station, I think at what, like 24, 25, Pisces with the North Node, Mercury retrograde, eclipse points, right? Like there's a lot still going to happen at the end of Pisces this year, but this is an ingress that is, it's going to feel real different, I think, than Saturn and
Yeah.
Pisces has felt for the last couple of years. And maybe we'll notice some similar kinds of sensations that we've felt with Neptune leaving Pisces and going into
Hmm.
Aries. Just that sort of going from a sort of diffuse, kind of like swimmy energy to more pointed, hot
Hmm.
energy that comes with the Aries territory.
By the time we start May, Venus is just like as a reminder to folks, Venus is already ingressed into Aries, just having ingressed at the end of April. So there's a lot happening in Aries.
Yeah, it's quite a bit. Saturn in Aries is one thing, but Saturn and Neptune together
Hmm.
in Aries is another thing. And this year, we don't get the exact conjunction between those two planets, but it gets close enough to count, basically, like horseshoes and hand grenades kind of deal. On the astrology podcast, Chris put out a 9 hour episode on the Saturn Neptune conjunction throughout history. And I actually contributed some research to that. So it was really interesting. Um, but we have one story in the news, the Pope dying,
Yeah.
that I think is a very, like, going to become one of the main Saturn Neptune stories actually for our
Hmm.
time. I think that there is going to probably be a lot of conflict around the selection of the new Pope. And my prediction is that there will either be a power vacuum in Rome where they can't choose one or can't agree on one, or I mean, this maybe feels like a stretch, but I wonder if there will be two popes recognized. Like
Oh,
one pope gets selected, but then someone else is like, no, this is the real pope. I don't know. I could see something like that happening because it's happened before in history. So,
yeah.
but I think I've also heard people being like that this was the last pope. There's not going to be another pope. That kind of like Neptunian signification of faith and religion and spirituality, and Saturn being like a structure and authority. And so this
Hmm.
sort of like interesting expressions of how those two things mix under Saturn and Neptune conjunction is something to be watching for this year and next as well.
Yeah. Let's do
Wild.
watch and see.
Let's do watch. Yeah. What are you looking out for, Sarah, with Saturn into Aries? How do you think that might speak to folks, maybe both on like a socio-political level, but maybe personally as well?
Yeah. So Saturn in Aries is Saturn in fall. And it makes sense, right? If Aries is the place of like hot and fast, it's Mars's home turf, and Saturn is cold and slow. Saturn wants to do sturdy, steady structures and values what is old and timeless. In Aries, which is like the baby and like get going, and those energies don't go together. So when we think about Saturn in Aries, we think about things like structures and leaders and things that we think of as timeless, maybe struggling. And so in our own lives, that might have to do with like irritation around things that we're trying to put in place for ourselves or have been put in place, like feeling like the foundations are shaking a little bit. Yeah, it may be hard to solidify things in that
Hmm.
kind of Saturnian way from how it was, particularly in the Capricorn Aquarius years, but maybe in most years compared to this upcoming Saturn chapter.
It kind of, for some reason, when you were talking, I got this image of, I remember being in class in high school or something, and we had to build like a bridge out of toothpicks really quickly, right? Like it was like go. And we had
Yeah.
maybe like an hour or something to build a bridge that could bear more weight than anyone else's bridge in the class. And it's just this sort of like, quick, make a structure,
Yeah.
hope it
Yes.
holds.
Right, which bridges you do not want your bridge builders to be in a super hurry and just using whatever's laying around. Like we need
No.
our bridges to be trustworthy and sturdy structures. So
Yeah.
Aries energy is not exactly bridge building energy. It's a really good metaphor actually for like a planet in a certain sign is like a planet in a place where it's looking for its tools, and Saturn and Aries can't find its tools. It doesn't have the tools that it needs to do the things that Saturn wants to do. So it's a great
Yeah.
metaphor.
So, and there's also some, the people who are most prepared or who understand or understood like geometry and physics did the best in the bridge building contest. Like they knew the power of the triangle. It was really like where you get the most sturdiness from. So I feel like that's interesting metaphorically to think about with this transit is like what are the good foundational principles for structures that hold up and last under pressure and won't just collapse. And I think we're already seeing in our government here in the US really fast systemic changes that are like
Yes.
not working, they're not sustainable, even just to speak of them really neutrally without a sort of moral or ethical lens, right? Just like all the financial changes that have happened already and the sort of frenzy that that's thrown folks into. Like people in finance have no clue what's happening. And they're like, we think he is doing this, but it really didn't work to do that. I'm also thinking of a couple cycles ago, Saturn and Aries was the late 60s and like the last few years of the 60s and thinking about the Vietnam War and all of the opposition to that war. And that has a very like Saturn and Aries vibe to me as well. Just like resistance to something that was very
Mm-hmm.
unsuccessful and a war that was really not very well thought out or executed. Not that, in my ethical opinion, any war is justifiable, but as far as wars go, that was a real bad one for everyone involved.
For sure. It also
Yeah.
makes me think about all the assassinations during that time as well. Hard for leaders to stay in their leadership positions because
Mm.
of martial kind of energy and violence. So,
Authorities, yeah, coming out
yeah.
of being in places of authority due to violence. Whew,
Yeah.
yeah. And then I think, as always, like on a personal note, we're looking at Saturn through our own charts. I always advise folks like if you have a day chart, it's gonna look different than if you have a night chart. So if you were born during daylight hours, Saturn is typically a little bit more securing and it might drag you, but at the end of being dragged, you will be in a better place. Whereas with folks with night charts, I think it shows up a lot differently, where Saturn can kind of be these prolonged periods of struggle where you're relieved when it's over because it sucked.
Hmm.
And don't worry, friends, because day chart people get their own nemesis with Mars and it just works differently. But yeah, so would you agree, Sarah, with that advice?
Yeah, I would. I think Saturn brings tests of endurance, and particularly for night chart folks who like to scurry under the cover of darkness and get things done quickly and move stealthily, Saturn makes sure we learn our lessons.
Okay, so we've talked about Saturn and Aries quite a bit, and we're going to be talking about it more because it's no quick thing. But that ingress is May 25th. And I was going to tell you, my friend is turning 40 that day. And this is a person who is a double Gemini, Gemini sun and rising, and a Leo moon. And he decided for his 40th birthday party that he wanted to have a clown themed party, which I don't know why Saturn and Aries feels like a clown to me. But it does. I think because clowns are kind of scary in a way, but also kind of like chaotic and fun. I don't know. I have to think about that. But yeah, everyone is supposed to dress up like a clown.
Oh
There are going
my
to be like
goodness.
30 people here. And so I'm really excited about that.
Does sound fun. Yeah, for me, it's my son is turning 18 and graduating from high school that week. And so the ingress happens literally as I'll be like pulling down the decorations and cleaning up everything and
Oh
sending
my
everyone home. Yeah,
gosh.
so much about like the way that my life is telling me I'm getting older and also like just a new chapter in time for my life and sending somebody out. It's like a big ritual of like sending someone out into the world.
And Saturn leaving your eighth is just like kind of this place of shared resources and stuff. And it's almost as if they're being reallocated through Saturn. That's really
Yes.
fascinating. Wow. That's a big deal, Sarah. So I'm excited for you and sad with you and all the things.
Thanks. Yeah,
Yeah. All right. Why don't we talk about the lunations for
sounds
this
good.
month? Because those tell us, they give us a lot of information. Like that full moon in April was a doozy. Okay, so May 12th, we are looking at a full moon in Scorpio at 22 degrees of Scorpio. And yeah, we have a kind of loose square to Mars, but that in this case feels maybe a little more positive because the moon is ruled by Mars and we can see the moon can see its ruler, which is typically strengthening. Mars in Leo is loud. It's loud. So I do expect this lunation to be loud, but everything's loud right now. It's hard to turn down the volume on
Mhm.
anything, it feels like. Sarah, what are you noticing about this chart?
By the time we get to May 12th and the full moon in Scorpio, we are on the other side of the Mars Pluto opposition. My guess is we'll still be feeling some reverberations from that third of three Mars Pluto oppositions coming because of that Mars retrograde cycle that it just took. So I think there might be something, just a little hit. Again, it's like loosely square. It's like square by sign for that opposition. There may be a moment of just like, ooh, I'm on the other side of that. And then you pointed out earlier, it's just for the sun and Uranus are just 4 degrees away from each other for this
Mm-hmm.
full moon. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, do you want to talk about what you were pointing out about that?
Well, the upheaval is my go-to Uranus word. I
Yeah.
mean, revolution, upheaval. I think that we are in a period, and I think we maybe talked about this last month, but Taurus I really think of as like the sign of the people. It's really just everyday people. It's your regular folk, I think belong in the sign of Taurus. And Uranus has been coming through here, and I think kind of fomenting a movement. I think that this full moon, we may see some response to
Hmm.
some sort of injustice or a mistreatment or some kind of culmination of a clash. If we're thinking about the moon in Scorpio fallen, right? Like I'm always thinking about the bodies, the people who are the most oppressed, the most marginalized, experiencing the worst that there is to whatever life is, you know, just like the worst that there is in life. And so it's interesting. There's a sort of grand fixed cross in this
Yeah.
chart. It's loose, it's like very loose, but just thinking about Pluto and Aquarius, we've got Mercury, Sun, and Uranus. And there is a square to the exact degree, almost to the exact minute here between Mercury
Yeah.
and Pluto. So that's no small deal. And Mars and Leo, Moon and Scorpio. So all these places of fixity where we really look for resources and life to be sustained and sustainable, but all the energies in these places are not necessarily happy, joyful, sustained energy, like planetary energies. I think that this might be a moment of like, this isn't fucking sustainable. What do we do about it? The suffering is not okay. People are pissed. We need a movement, right? It feels like grinding kind of in areas that don't even necessarily want to move or be moved.
Yeah, that's true. There's like fixed sign energy is like, let's just stay here, hold our ground, kind of. And yeah, obviously, If there's anything that astrology keeps teaching me is that everything is in motion all the time, despite my best efforts as a major fixed sign person. I think that we'll feel that sort of like stubbornness aspect of the resistance in like changes that are afoot. And I also want to connect, this is about 5 days before the Sun and Uranus are conjunct in Taurus. And you pointed out that's not going to happen again in our lifetime.
Yeah,
So
not yours and
from
mine,
now
maybe
on.
in some of our younger listeners.
Yeah,
Anyone who plans to stick around for another 84 years, you'll see it.
that's true. There are some people on Earth who will see that again.
Yeah.
But for most of us, we won't. And Uranus and Gemini is ominous transit for those of us who have studied that transit throughout history. And now the sun will conjoin Uranus there. So when the sun comes to illuminate things in a kind of bright, blazing way, it will be illuminating that instead
Hmm.
of the movement of the people that we've been tracing through like labor movements and agricultural movements and things like that that have felt really Taurian
Yeah,
in their
climate
energy.
movements.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff here. It's fraught energy. And also, I have a little bit of hope in this chart too, of like, there's other stuff happening here. And Venus is moving into a sextile with Jupiter, even though those planets are both in exile. I'm just so ready for some planets to have dignity again.
It's been a dearth of that,
A dearth of dignity.
a
A
dearth of
dearth of
dignity. And
dignity.
Saturn in Aries really hits home on the dearth of dignity for sure.
God. Okay. Well, yeah. So I would say on a personal note on this May 12th full moon, you may be thinking to yourself, like, something's got to give in these fixed areas,
Yeah.
potentially. Any kind of questions for reflection that you think may come up or topics for folks on a personal basis with this?
I guess I'm thinking it feels like some endings. Like the Mars Pluto opposition is over. We're gonna feel it, but not as strong. And the same with Uranus and Taurus being highlighted here is kind of the end of this chapter. So maybe it's a little bit of like an opportunity to reflect on what have those grinding oppositions and squares and placements in general meant for my life in the fixed axes, and what do I want to take forward from that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that there is some sort of like culmination here around those Mars Pluto oppositions and what they have meant for folks. So, okay, let's take a look at the new moon on May 26th, which is at 6 degrees of Gemini. It is conjunct Mercury in Gemini, co-present with Jupiter in Gemini. I mean, so far, kind of cute.
Yeah.
We have sextiles to the malefics and a trine to Pluto between Mercury and Pluto and the moon and Pluto. Actually, overall, this is looking, it's got a different flavor than a lot of the lunations we've been looking at so far this year.
It's true. Mercury is coming up on its Kazemi. Am I?
I think the Kazim is the 29th,
Yeah.
final days of May.
Saturn is 9 minutes into Aries at this point. So it'll be just after the clown birthdays and the graduations and all of that. We will have this new moon, like, okay, what are we starting now? This new 40-year-old is starting a chapter, certainly, with the sun and moon and Gemini here. And yeah, a new graduate sort of starting a new chapter. So there's some kind of like, okay, after this ingress, after these retrograde cycles completed, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and kind of like a, okay, what are some of the projects we want to undertake now in a Gemini
Yeah.
fashion?
Yeah, and maybe even really laying the groundwork for Uranus's ingress into Gemini here a bit, and the sort of shifting and feeling tone from, okay, we've had Saturn in Pisces and Uranus in Taurus, and they've been in a loose sextile to one another. And actually, one of the main one of the main transits that we're having throughout 2025 and 2026, I believe, is Saturn sextile Uranus. And that doesn't happen all the time. I think people just have, they don't talk about sextiles a lot because they're like, why? And I'm like, oh, maybe because it's Venus's
I was going to
aspect.
say, You're not going to
And
let that go.
yeah, I'm not going to let it go. But, there is a sort of chemistry between planets that are
Hmm.
sextile to one another. And so I think that maybe this new moon might be a little bit like, what's this chemistry going to look like with
Hmm.
this sextile between Saturn and Uranus in the early degrees of Aries and Gemini? And then that's also interacting with Pluto in the early degrees of Aquarius. So we have this sort of like arrow shape of these powerhouse planets all kind of working together, which, I think listening to it was Austin Coppock was saying, like, he was calling it like a flying V formation, which was
Hmm.
a move in football. It's an illegal play in the NFL now because of how many people died. Not were injured, but died doing this formation where basically the offensive line would form this kind of V and just mow through people. So, yeah, maybe this new moon is kind of giving us a little bit of a preview into some of that.
I like that idea. It'll be held together by Saturn in fall, which I think will be interesting to see.
The old man in the
Again,
tank.
not necessarily the bridge that I want built, but let's see what happens.
There's a certain undeniable force here that is interesting. It's
Hmm.
interesting for sure. But as far as the lunations go this year, it's not as spicy. It's not as spicy, but it's definitely one to look out for. Like, what are the seeds that are being sown
Hmm.
around this time? Notable transits for this month. I think we picked out a few conjunctions really. Saturn into Aries is really the big thing. And I do think that May is going to be a bit of a breather after March and April, which I think everyone kind of universally agreed were going to be the two hardest months of 2025, or, just most challenging. So everything after that is kind of like we're getting oriented to all the change that was initiated in March and April. But we have Venus conjunct Neptune on May 2nd, which is the second time that a planet is conjoining Neptune in its new sign. So that will be interesting. I will be interested to see what sort of fights or assertions break out, maybe around topics of women, femmes, trans people, queer people, people who experience gender marginalization. That seems interesting to look out for.
I think I'm still gathering data on Neptune and Aries and
Yeah.
what exactly that is going to add to things like Venus and Aries.
Well, and it's interesting because Venus is going back into Aries after her retrograde there,
Hmm.
and Neptune wasn't there when she stationed
Right.
retrograde. And I think she is this right that she went when she went back into Pisces, Neptune was still there, was her ingress.
Yeah.
This is like she left this territory, but she's going back, and now there's another energy there. So I think that there may be a quality of like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
With like, I thought this was one way. I left this one way, but I came back, and now there's like a seawater king chilling out here. Don't know what to do with that. Very descriptive, I know, but I think there just may be this quality of kind of like confusion or like, what's going on. This wasn't the way
Yeah.
it was when I left it with
That's what I
Venus.
picture too. Yeah.
Yes. And then, as we mentioned in that full moon chart on the 12th, Sun is approaching a conjunction with Uranus, which happens on the 17th. And then Mercury also conjoins Uranus on the 24th. So we're getting these Uranian conjunctions. And typically with those is there is some sort of surprising news. Often is what I find that happens with that, or just like, hey, plot twist, didn't think that this was going to happen, but it did. And now we have to kind of regroup or readjust to that.
I think of the 29th degree as a degree where there's often disruption anyway.
Hmm.
So, what is Uranus at the 29th degree? Maybe even more kind
Hmm.
of that disruption energy as it comes to the end. And these planets that pass through that gateway of late Uranus and Taurus maybe highlight some of what that late energy is going to
Hmm.
feel like
Hmm.
as it gets even closer to 29 degrees.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll see that too more in June, I think, when Uranus is arrives at that last degree of Taurus. And
Yeah.
I think that there is a Venus Uranus conjunction at 29 Taurus. So that'll be really interesting. But yeah, what are these stories of Uranus going through this part of your chart personally that are sort of getting wrapped up here? Because these are going to be some of the last conjunctions to Uranus in this sign in our lifetime. So I think that's a really interesting question. For me, it's Uranus going through my eighth house. It's marked a lot of like, I bought a joint property with folks under
Yeah.
this transit. I had some deaths happen under this transit and some inheritances of money because of those deaths. And so, yeah, really interesting for me to see how those stories are kind of wrapping up actually under these transits. So, yeah, checking out that Taurus area of your chart, and it's angular for you, babe.
I've had such huge disruptions in my 10th house very shortly after Uranus's ingress into Taurus.
Wow.
And it really does feel like those have calmed considerably, but pretty steadily the whole time Uranus has been in my 10th has been a lot of upheaval in my kind of public life and vocation, public
Hmm.
aspects of my vocation. So
Yeah.
I, would never say I'm looking forward to Uranus in Gemini, but I think it's okay to feel relieved about the personal aspect of when it leaves my 10th.
Yeah. Would you say, have there been positive elements of the any of those upheavals?
Yes, I would say those upheavals have been a chance for me to have clarity about how to align, let's say, my first and 10th or my fourth and 10th houses in ways that without those really kind of critical and chaotic disruptions, I might not have ever pushed myself to that kind of greater alignment. So,
Mm,
yeah, I think those
yeah.
things, again, maybe a little bit like what a malefic does. Like, you don't love it while it's happening, and then you can look back and say, ooh, I see how this brought me a kind of peace that I might not otherwise have had.
Don't cry because it's over. Smile because it happened.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. It's like you can read my soul.
I know you say stuff like that all the time, so it's not that hard.
I know. It's like you know me so well.
Oh my God, exalted Saturn. I'm dead. Oh my God. So good. Uranus in the eighth has been, of course, there's been a lot of grief and, and a lot of like having to act very quickly and then having a lot of disruptions. But God, I've learned so much about these eighth house topics
You
and
really have.
will make more stable choices going
Yeah.
forward because of what I learned about the instability of my decisions that and it of no real fault of my own, just life, right? Like you're just learning. And so you're like, I think this is the right thing. And then,
Mhm.
so yeah, gratitude for Uranus through Taurus and for all the lessons. So the last note that I have here is the Mercury Cazimi on the 29th. This is the superior Cazimi. Mercury is direct. And, this is always a day for just something might just come through, right? Like it's just sort of a bullseye kind of transit where I think I remember on one of these, maybe last year, or the year before, I got like a huge like job that day that was just
Mm.
sort of everything just sort of fell right into place, and it was like there was a narrow window and it just worked out. So that's kind of what I think of with the Kazimis is there just may be an inbreaking that's kind of just right for the moment that day. So that's the 29th. And it's in Gemini. So this is in Mercury's home. And
Mhm.
that's pretty cool. I think that's pretty
Yeah.
cool. Are we looking at any other things during May?
I think it's worth noting that Mars is going to pass the point where it turned retrograde for this really long cycle, and Venus
God.
is going to pass the point where it turned retrograde for its own retrograde cycle. And those retrogrades have just kind of dominated the atmosphere for a really long time, Mars
Yeah.
especially, for a really, really long time. there's something for me about marking those moments where the planet is moving beyond where the whole thing, started.
Mm-hmm.
And so that feels, so that's the 2nd of May for Mars. So it's like right at the top of the month for May is like, okay, that is done. Like,
Yeah.
what did you learn? And for Venus is more mid-month, middle of May. And so I think it's worth noting that we're getting some closure there. What we do with the closure is up to us, but we're getting some closure there. And with the end of the Mercury retrograde cycle, with the exception of Pluto, which is stationing retrograde and not leaving Aquarius for the first time, all the
Mm-hmm.
planets are direct in May. So that's also kind of a thing. Like,
Direct.
it does at least feel like we're moving forward and we're moving forward together kind of energy. I'm into
Well,
that.
and I think like April was so characterized by Venus stationary conjunct Saturn, which is just like, where the fuck do we go now? Right? I mean, we're seeing that play out on so many levels.
Yeah.
And it does just sort of feel, to me, that felt like I know where I am. This territory makes sense, given all this action. But I'm not really entirely sure where to head next and like what makes sense. Or I kind of have an idea of what's on the horizon, but it's not very clear right now. And I do think that May is going to bring some clarity around things that we've just sort of been sitting with. And it's
Mm.
that April to me was really just like, sit your ass down.
Yeah.
You're here now. Like, just be. And it's been uncomfortable. So May is, I mean, especially once we get into Gemini season, right, which it begins on the 20th. That is snappy energy. That is like, bloop, 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 bloop. Especially with a sextile to Mars in Leo. Like, we're going to be motoring. Yeah, moving.
Uh,
What do you think? What do you think are would be like a good spiritual practice or sort of tenet of spirituality to be like thinking about or looking to in May?
Late Taurus season is a great time to take a blanket to the park, whether that's metaphorically or actually, and literally lie there, look at the sky, look at the trees, and think about where you've come from, even
Mm,
since late 2024. Like, what you've been through, what you've come through, what we as a country, for those of us living in the US, have seen and come through since, like, let's just say November. And like for me, the question of like, how then shall we live comes to mind. It's like from our shared religious tradition in Christianity, it's like post Easter, pre Pentecost, it's like this moment where it's like, how do I want to live with this message that I've received? How do I want to be in myself with the message that I have? So
mm.
maybe there's something about that.
Yeah, yeah. It's I'm glad that even though there's such a shit show happening, that we do get to enjoy some like nice weather and being
Yeah.
outside and I don't know, dressing a little slutty maybe. The spiritual
Yeah.
practice of
Springtime.
dressing slutty.
Yeah. Yeah, communicating our like virility and fertility and attractiveness is what the plants and flowers are doing in much of the northern hemisphere. It's what we in our bodies are doing. I mean, spring is a time for like vitality.
Taurus season is the exaltation of the moon and it's Venus's season. So really these embodied pleasure practices I think are actually a great spiritual
Yeah.
invitation because it is a reminder that there's so much going on. But like we still get to be here in these bodies having this experience and that is sacred and holy. I think theologies that like renounce or deny the body, I mean, I think there's a time and a place for that, but I also think it can venture into bullshit territory for me, which that's a great Taurus word, right? Bullshit. But like we're here in these bodies for a reason. So permission to enjoy them and to practice that in a spiritual way, right? Or to associate that with spirituality, I think is really lovely.
I like it.
Moving into Gemini season, right? Being open to the communications that we are exchanging, receiving from the divine I think that that's really neat too. Once we've gotten grounded in the body, I mean, the body is what receives messages. That's how, anytime we're getting information, it's through the body. And so I think that also counts for spiritual information too, is being received and processed by the body. Well, have a wonderful month, Legends and Star Pals. I will have presented at LA Astrofest by the time this comes out, and
Yay.
keep a lookout for my episode with the astrology podcast on Venus retrograde in the news. Thanks so much, Sarah, and take good care.
You too.